Býð ykkur hjartanlega velkomin á þennan fyrirlestur. Ég heiti Hörður Þorgilsson, sálfræðingur og formaður Dáleiðslufélags Íslands. Þessi fyrirlestur, hann samstarfsverkefni 3 aðila. Það eru Dáleiðslufélagið, Félags, sérfræðinga, klínískri sálfræði og Endurmentunar sem stöndum að þessu. Frumkvæðið hins vegar að þessum fyrirlestur kemur frá Dr. Yapko. Honum mikið mun að stuðla að upplýsandi umræðu þunglyndi, bæði til að skapa skilning fyrirbærið og benda á lausnir. Dr. Yapko, hann hér á landi á vegum Endurmenntunar, Háskóla Íslands og Dáleiðslufélagsins og að kenna rúmlega 30 manns, allt fagfólk í viðurkenndum heilbrigðisstéttum, allt dáleiðslu og ekki síst beitingu dáleiðslu í varðandi þunglyndi. Hann núna í 6 daga lotu sem seinni lota. Fyrri lotan var fyrr í sumar og var líka 6 dagar. Og ég ekki frá því að við séum að verða svona bærilega sjálfbjarga í þessum efnum. Og hann hefur fært það í tal við okkur að við ættum í kjölfar þessa fyrirlestrar að við ættum að bjóða fólki upp á það að það geti leitað eftir þjónustu. Og fyrir þá sem að það vilja, þá vil ég benda á 2 leiðir. Annars vegar erum við á heimasíðu Dáleiðslufélagsins að koma okkur upp svona þessu kallað þjónustu. Þar eru nokkrir aðilar búin að skilgreina sig hvað þeir fást við, en þar fyrir utan listi yfir alla félagsmenn líka á heimasíðunni. Og þá vil ég líka benda á heimasíðu Félags, sérfræðinga í klínískri sálfræði, þar sem að félagatal og til þessara aðila hægt að leita. En þar fyrir utan eru að sjálfsögðu fjöldi einstaklinga sem að ég vil almennt leggja áherslu og það skiptir öllu að leita sér til þeirra sem hafa löggildingu og fullnægjandi menntun. Ég á von á því að við verðum öll upplýstari eftir að hafa lít á Dr. Yapko, en fyrir þá sem að vilja vita meira þá bendum við á 2 bækur sem við pöntum. Þær eru því miður uppseldar, fengum ekki kannski nægilega mörg eintök, en þær eru annars vegar bókin sem að kannski svolítið, hann mun tala hér út frá, þessi að Depression is contagious, og svo hins vegar Breaking the Patterns of Depression sem svona meira kannski sjálfshjálpar bók. Við sömdum við bóksölu stúdenta að þessar bækur eru til hér á 20% afslætti og en að því þær eru uppseldar þá bjóðum við fólki upp á það að skrá sig á lista. Bækurnar eru þarna við innganginn, þannig og þar á að liggja fyrir listi sem að fólk getur skráð sig á með símanúmeri og netfangi og það verður haft samband við komandi þegar að bækurnar eru tilbúnar. Fyrirkomulag hér það verið mjög einfalt. Dr. Yapko talar í cirka klukkutíma, en síðan verða umræður á eftir og fyrirspurnir úr sal og við hvetjum ykkur til þess að formúlera spurningar, skrifa þær hjá okkur og síðan að spyrja. Og við reynum að vera hér á þönum með mikrofóna þannig að það heyrist í okkur. En áður en ég hleypi í Dr. Yapko þá langar mig að segja nokkur orð hann, svo að ykkur verði ljóst hver hann Dr. Yapko klínískur sálfræðingur, hjónabands- og fjölskylduþerapisti sem býr í Fallbrook í Kaliforníu. Hann nýtur alþjóðlegra viðurkenninga fyrir vinnu sína við þunglyndi og árangursmiðaða meðferð og kennir reglulega fagfólki víða veröld. Honum hefur á ferli sínu verið boðið að kynna hugmyndir sínar og meðferð fyrir fagfólki í heilbrigðisþjónustu í meira en 30 löndum og 6 heimsálfum, auk nær allra ríkja Bandaríkjanna. Og í rúma 3 áratugi hefur Dr. Yapko haft sérstakan áhuga á öllum þáttum og blæbrigðum skammtíma meðferðar. Hvernig beita má dáleiðslu til þess að skapa nýja reynslu og nýta í meðferð þunglyndis. Hann höfundur 12 bóka og ritstjóri 3 annarra og nýjasta bókin hans Depression is contagious, How the most common mood disorder is spreading around the world and how to stop it. En einnig má nefna Hand-me-down blues, How to stop depression from spreading in families og Breaking the Patterns of Depression. Og bækur hans hafa verið þýddar á 9 tungumál. Dr. Yapko félagi í samtökum bandarískra sálfræðinga og í samtökum bandarískra hjón- og fjölskylduþerapista, félagi í alþjóðasamtökum dáleiðslu og bandarísku dáleiðslu samtökunum. Hann fengið fjölmargar viðurkenningar við framlag sitt til klínískrar dáleiðslu og sálrænnar meðferðar. Og hann nefnir fyrirlestum sem flytur nú fyrir okkur Þunglyndi smitandi, félagslegir þættir þunglindis og þýðing þeirra fyrir meðferð og sjálfshjálp. Dr. Yapko, having been so many times and for so long in Iceland, I am sure you understood everything I said. And if you didn't, don't worry. I just described the context of your lecture and said a few things about you, mostly nice things. We appreciate your generous gesture, and I give you the floor.
Thank you. Yeah, I understood all of it. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate the turnout. I'm really surprised how many people want to talk about depression. I will talk about depression in a way that I hope is not depressing. I'm hoping that I'll be giving you some information that you can use, some perspective that you can use. I have been studying depression now full-time for almost the last 40 years. And I can tell you that the field has changed dramatically in the time that I have been working in it. The things that we have come to understand about the nature of depression, the most fundamental questions. Who gets depressed? Why? Under what conditions? And most importantly, of course, what can we do about it? What can we do about it by way of treatment? What can we do about it in terms of prevention? Well, the fact that we have this Hypnosis Society sponsoring this, people have already asked me, so why is the Hypnosis Society sponsoring this? And one of the things that we have learned along the way is how incredibly important your quality of focus is and the direction of your focus. To put it simply, so many people become depressed because of what they focus on. They focus on what's wrong instead of what's right. They focus on weaknesses and vulnerabilities and pathology instead of recognizing strengths. And it raises one of the most fundamental questions. Is the goal to shrink pathology, or is the goal to expand wellness? And that may sound like a semantic issue to some, quibbling over words, but it represents two very different philosophies of treatment, two very different philosophies of life. And it's really the involvement that I've had in the field of hypnosis all these years that has led to some of the most important discoveries about what people respond to, how the quality of their expectations influences their treatment response. And so it's an absolute natural that a Hypnosis Society would sponsor a talk like this. How can we gather people's attention and direct it in ways that serve them better? So for many people, of course, the only thing they know about hypnosis is the silly Hollywood stuff, the silly stage stuff. But it's a very serious approach, examining in depth what the value of focus really is in determining your quality of life. And this is the starting point for tonight's lecture. I'm going to be taking your attention and moving it in a very specific direction. Too often when people think about depression, they have bought into the idea that this is a mental disease, that this is the product of biology or neurology. If you stop any person on the street and just ask, so what do you think causes depression? It's amazing how many people will say it's about a biochemical imbalance in the brain. And I find that very surprising and very disheartening, actually, because what it means is that the advertising has worked and people just aren't aware of the science. So I'm hoping I can reacquaint you tonight with a different perspective about the nature of depression, and not one that totally contradicts what you might believe, but certainly, hopefully, expands what you understand about the nature of this very complicated disorder. Well, a little bit of background. I'm a clinical psychologist. I do treatment. I've spent the last almost 40 years now dealing with people who are depressed, individuals, couples, families. And when you focus on depression, it could easily be depressing. You're listening to stories all the time about the worst things that happen in people's lives. And at the same time, it has given a lot of insight into what it takes for people to be able to manage the inevitable adversities of life. Nobody gets out of here alive. If you have a job, you run the risk of losing it. If you take a class, you run the risk of failing it. If you get into a relationship, you run the risk of losing it. The people we love die. The pets that we care for die. We take our car in for a car wash, and a flock of birds flies over it 20 minutes later. There are always things happening in life that are unpleasant and even traumatizing. What I've been particularly interested in is when people face these terrible challenges, people who you would think would probably sink into depression, and they don't. And I've been more than a little curious about why not. What is it about the way some people cope with adversity that somehow serves to insulate them against depression? What can we learn from those people? So that's been a large focus of my research over the years. And interestingly, the skills that people have that help protect them are skills they're not even aware that they have. If you ask them directly, somebody else would be pretty depressed after this. How come you're not? They say very general things like, I guess I must just have good genes. I guess I'm just lucky. Or the ever popular around here, hey, I'm Icelandic. But of course, when somebody gives you that kind of general answer, it doesn't help you. It doesn't really teach you anything about what have we learned about what protects people. And certainly one of the things that we've learned that protects people is other people. The quality of the relationships that people develop over time. Now this is a part of depression that most people haven't paid attention to. And in fact, in 1999, just 14 years ago, when I wrote the book called Hand-Me-Down Blues, where I was examining what are called transgenerational risk factors for depression. How does a parent transmit depression to a child? Unintentionally, of course. But statistically, we know that the child of a depressed parent is anywhere from 3 to 6 times more likely to become depressed than the child of a non-depressed parent. Just having a depressed parent is one of the strongest risk factors there is. Well, when we look at the epidemiology, the study of prevalence, it's the 25 to 44-year-olds who have the highest rate of depression. That's not really much of a surprise. And the people in that age range share a lot of different characteristics. But one of the characteristics that they share is that they're in their prime childbearing years. So it's really not much of a surprise that the fastest growing group of depression sufferers are their children. Children are the fastest growing group. And really, I'm very concerned about that, of course, because as we watch depression move from one generation to the next, we're not only seeing it increase in prevalence, frequency, we're also seeing it increase in severity. If you're 18 years old and struggling, I'm concerned about you. And to be honest, 10 years from now, when you have a child, I'm even more concerned about your child. So I have focused on what can we do about this generational transmission, and what can we do about the social transmission. We're watching depression increase everywhere around the world and in every age group. Now that, one of the questions people often ask is that simply because we're more aware of it? Is that simply because we're better at detecting it? And the answer is no. It's not about the fact that we're more sensitive to it. It's not about the fact that more people are going for treatment. In fact, more people aren't going for treatment. Depression has a very low help-seeking behavior. Most of the people who suffer depression don't bother to ask for help for one very specific reason. They don't think they can get help. They think that this is something they just have to live with, or that's just the way it is, or it's about their own personal weakness. And people who suffer in silence, and that's how it spreads in terms of untreated depression, unchecked depression that infects relationships, especially within the family where it's the most concentrated, but certainly across society. We've seen huge changes taking place in our world in general, but even for those of you that are a little bit older, think about what life in Iceland looked like 20 years ago. I first came to Iceland in 1997, I think. It might have been 1996. So what, 16 years, 17 years? I see the difference. Just as a visitor on occasion. The quality of life has changed. The quality of relationships has changed. The influence of technology has infected every part of our lives. And technology is not value-free. There's a consequence for looking at your cell phone every 2 minutes. There's a consequence for texting instead of calling. There's a consequence for going into a chat room instead of actually meeting somebody face to face for a cup of coffee. And the consequences for how we use our brains and how we use our social lives, this is all so new that researchers are behind on what's actually happening in terms of effects on social relationships and consequently effect on mood states and how we view other people and how we view our relationships. So having spent so much of my professional life looking at these kinds of issues, the more that we have learned about the brain, the more we have learned about how socially defined the brain is. Many people in my profession call it the social brain. How wired we are to be responsive to other people and reactive to other people in a variety of ways. Well, obviously after all of this time in the field, I have my biases, my way of looking at things. But I also strive very hard to be objective about things. When I had the honor of being asked to write the section on treating depression for Encyclopedia Britannica, you can't write for Encyclopedia Britannica and say it's true just because I said it. It's all about data and being able to back up what you say. And interestingly, when I asked Encyclopedia Britannica, out of all the depression experts in the world, why did you choose me? They said, because you're so balanced in the way you look at things and the way you teach about things. You're scientifically informed, but you're also humanistically inclined. I like that phrase, scientifically informed, humanistically inclined, so I had it tattooed right here. I'll show you later. So, it's important to appreciate the science side of the equation, and I'm happy to talk about that side of the equation. But it's also, some of the things that we manage in life, science isn't going to help us. And it's really about the artistry and about the skill of living well, and I hope to give you some ideas about that. So my intention then for tonight is to talk for roughly 45 minutes, maybe as long as 60 minutes, And then what I want to be able to do is address your questions. You came here for a reason. And I'll take questions at the end. Please hold them to the end. And then if there's anything you want me to comment on, anything you want me to respond to, or I can provide a quick answer, I mean, there are many people here, I'm sure many questions will come, or I could provide a relatively quick answer, I'm very happy to do that. It's why I'm here. Okay. So one of the things that we've come to appreciate is what is called psychoeducation. When we look at what determines people's ability to respond well to treatment, to education, the facts that we provide people, it just becomes clear over and over again that the more educated somebody is, and I mean educated about depression, the better they do. The better they do in treatment, the better the quality of their recovery, the better their rate of recovery. Now, curiously, depression happens to be the most researched mental health term on the internet. The problem is people go to the internet and they find information that they really don't have a way of knowing, is this credible? Has this passed the test of time? And so, as your great navigator and pioneer Leif Erikson said, beware of quotes on the internet, not all are true. So we're dealing with a problem that is in many ways poorly defined. Here in Iceland, you use a diagnostic system called the ICD, the International Classification of Diseases. And it gives a little checklist of symptoms. And if you have enough of these symptoms, then you get the diagnosis of depression. The problem is when we have so many different symptom combinations that are possible, 227 different symptom combinations that would all correctly yield a diagnosis of major depression, that tells you something about how soft the diagnosis is. How much depression is, in a sense, in the eye of the beholder. So for me personally, I'm less interested in the label. I'm much more interested in the quality of life, the quality of this person's experience. But interestingly now, in the United States, physicians, because they tend to see people more frequently who present symptoms of depression, have been asked to ask their patients just 2 questions that have a diagnostic reliability that is impressive. I'll tell you what the 2 questions are, and you think for yourself how you would answer it if you're thinking or wondering whether you're depressed. The 2 questions are, first, about mood. Have you been feeling sad, down, depressed, blue for a month or more? Not 2 weeks as in the diagnostic manual, but for a month or more. The second question is about what's called anhedonia, the loss of pleasure. Have you lost interest in or stopped deriving pleasure from the things that normally interest you or the things that normally give you pleasure? Now, if you say yes to either or both of those questions, it doesn't automatically mean you're depressed, but it does mean time to take a closer look. It's certainly one of the most reliable indicators that people just don't derive much pleasure anymore. And of course, that's one of the first casualties of depression is a sense of humor. It's the worst thing in the world when you're talking to a depressed person and you crack a joke and the best that they can do is go, Sense of humor is really the first casualty. So the fact that depression is a broad label that represents a lot of different experiences. What I'm really interested in when I say quality of life is, how do you feel about how you're doing overall? Obviously, you don't decide something like that on a bad day, and you certainly don't decide something like that on a good day. Overall. And what are the things that you do well? What are the things where you find yourself having difficulty time and again that represent some of your vulnerable areas? Well, the starting place, I think, for most people, the question that I get asked the most. It's the worst thing when you're at a cocktail party and somebody corners you and starts telling you about how depressed their mother is, and then they ask the question, so what causes depression? Now think about your answer to that question. If I just met you casually and I asked you, what do you think causes depression? Think about your answer to that. Your answer is critically important because how you think about it determines what you can do and what you can't do. How you think about depression determines whether you're less likely to overcome it or more likely to overcome it. So it's a critically important question. And to be candid or honest with yourself, if you think that you're depressed because you're blaming your genes and genetic history, you're far less likely to take any positive steps in your own behalf. So this question determines everything, whether you'll seek treatment, what kind of treatment you'd be likely to seek, how well you would respond to that treatment, and certainly even how you'll relate to all the things I talk about. If your answer is depression is caused by genes, then you're going to have a hard time with some of the things that I say. If you're convinced depression's about a biochemical imbalance in the brain, I can tell you the drug companies love you. They hope you'll keep buying their drugs. And while that's an interesting perspective, it's hardly true. And as the evidence has grown, well, there's a lot that I can say about the drug side of the equation. I'll make just a few general comments about it, but it might change some of your ideas about that by the time we get through this tonight. So what causes depression? Look at all of these different factors. Is it about genetics? Is it about a biochemical imbalance in the brain? So what about systemic inflammation? What about psychosocial stressors? And go all the way down the list. This is what makes it complicated. If you review the science, there is evidence for every single one of these factors and more. And then the big question is, so in any given individual's case, what's going on? How can we distinguish that for one person, this is about their cognitive distortions and that's why they should have cognitive therapy, and why in another case do we say that there's all kinds of family issues here that are leading this person into their depression? The pathway into depression is different for each person. The pathway out is different for each person. If you came here tonight hoping to get a formula, there isn't one. What you can do is learn what the puzzle pieces are and how these puzzle pieces come together in your particular case. But what your life is about and what your particular problems and vulnerabilities are about is quite different from somebody else's. So it's valuable to learn from other people's experience, but you also can't assume that what works for one person is going to work for someone else. And like life itself, each person has to discover their own path. And I'm hoping what I can do is give you tips for how to stay on a path that makes sense, how to make use of information, which is really why I'm here. So that's why the best answer that I can give you is depression is caused by many different factors, and they'll be different from person to person. You might have noticed, though, if you thought about it, that when I gave you that list of different causal factors or contributing factors, you can easily group them into 3 different domains. Some of the factors are biological. Does biology matter? Absolutely. There are many diseases where depression is a predictable consequence. There are many medications where depression is a predictable side effect. Is there a gene for depression? The best answer at this point is no. Are there genes that make you vulnerable to depression? The best answer is yes. So biology matters, but it has been overstated, as if wherever you see depression, there's somehow a brain disease there. It isn't like that. In the second domain, you see the psychological components. That includes things like the quality of your thinking. It's why cognitive behavioral therapy is so popular in Iceland. The focus is on the quality of people's thinking, how they process information, predictable and systematic errors that people make. For example, people who take things personally that really aren't personal. Their team loses in the finals and they're sure it's because of something they did. They're probably taking it a little too personally. Things like personal history and the kinds of experiences that have shaped your perspective and shaped your understanding, the kind of individual values that you've grown up with, what are the values that you hold and how do they play out in the choices that you make in life, what is your individual style of coping, how do you deal with pressure, how do you deal with failure, how do you deal with when people leave, and when people move away, and when people betray you, and do all the things that people do. Your style of coping with stress and with changes and adaptations. How you deal with things like phones going off in your lecture determines a lot about your quality of life experience. And then, of course, the third domain is the social domain, which is really what I intend to focus on this evening. Here we're looking at what is the relationship between the quality of one's relationships and vulnerability to depression. What is it about culture? What is it about family environments? What is it about marriages? What is it about when you have depressed parents raising children? What happens when you have depressed children raising parents? So, as I focus on the social side of this, it's because over time, the evidence has only grown stronger and stronger and stronger, that in a way we missed all the clues that should have pointed us 30 years ago in the direction of people's relationships. But we're getting there now. There are brand new fields emerging. One is called interpersonal neurobiology. What can we learn about the effects on the brain and the nervous system about what happens when people are in relationship with each other? Another field, affective neuroscience. What is the relationship between one's mood states and the kinds of decision making that they engage in, and of course the consequences of that? So when we look at the biology of depression, the social brain as I referred to it, how much the phrase two people who have chemistry turns out to be more accurate than we ever thought, less metaphor and more factual than we ever thought. Well, the quality of your relationships is what increases or decreases your vulnerability to depression. When we look at, just as one very strong example, most countries don't have the money to do this. The United States spends a great deal of money on what is called epidemiological surveys. Surveys designed to find out how prevalent are various disorders in the United States. In other words, how many people have breast cancer, how many people have prostate cancer, how many people suffer Tourette's syndrome, how many people suffer any disorder. So thousands and thousands of examiners fan out into the communities, and they're interviewing people not by diagnostic labels, but according to symptom profiles. And then professional raters and professional diagnosticians diagnose it. So we have an amazing amount of information about the frequency of different disorders. Curiously, when we look at depression in particular, when people report depression, they are 10 times to 25 times more likely to report marital distress, family distress. that depression gives rise to serious problems within the family and vice versa. That when there is marital distress, there is at least 10 times more likelihood of depression. Now, what do I mean by marital distress? Arguing all the time, bickering all the time, coldness in the relationship, meaning lack of warmth, lack of affection, conflict makes it very difficult for people to feel emotionally safe, emotionally stable. So that epidemiology, the most expensive and extensive epidemiological survey ever done on Earth, that cost billions of dollars to do, made it abundantly clear how much the quality of relationships influences people's outlook and mood states. That says something about how important it is for people to have the skills to build relationships. It's always amazing to me when here I am dealing with a young woman who is crushed because this guy that she fell in lust with has gone. And when I ask him, so what about this guy? What attracted you to him? He was so cute. Now, you have to admire the depth of that analysis, but it's indicative of how people respond to form, not substance. How people get sidetracked by image and lose sight of the deeper questions of who is this person and how do they do things. The art of building relationships is dwindling quick as the divorce rate increases. The divorce rate in Iceland for first marriages, about 50%. For second marriages, about 70%. Do people learn from their experience? They do. They learn that they can walk away. So it's really vitally important from a mental health perspective and from a depression perspective. How are we equipping especially our younger people with the skills that they need? You're not going to learn them on Facebook, and you're not going to learn them on Twitter, and you're not going to learn them in any chat room. Isn't it remarkable? Online dating. 1 in 5 marriages now starts online. That's a remarkable statistic for something that didn't even exist a decade ago. So looking at these things, well, when people get lost in the idea that this is about genetics, there's a whole new field called epigenetics. Epigenetics is the study of how environmental influences shape gene expression. It's such a remarkable shift that's taken place, literally at the turn of the century. The understanding at that time was that human beings had about 100,000 genes, and the assumption was wherever you saw a particular disorder, you would find a gene responsible for it. In fact, the predominant model was called the one gene, one disease model, and it was known by its acronym, OGOD. So now that the Human Genome Project is completed, it's shaken up everything. To discover that human beings only have about 25,000 genes, literally less than a grain of rice, raises cosmic questions of how can we possibly be so complicated with so few relative genes. But what we've found out is it's not about the genes. It's about epigenetics. How does the environment you grow up in, the environment you live in, influence genetic expression? And it's why we watch people change over time. It's why we can watch identical twins end up in very different places over the span of a few years. If you're not familiar with epigenetics, I show you this cover for a reason. Time magazine did a cover story on it. It's still online. If you go to time.com and you type in the search engine epigenetics. But as you see, the cover story is why your DNA isn't your destiny. that's an important message for people who get drawn into the idea that depression is about genes. Well, my mother was depressed, my grandmother was depressed, my uncle was depressed. Gee, depression runs in my family. I must have the depression gene. There are even therapists who will say that to their clients, not knowing there isn't a depression gene, it's misinformation. So when we look at the social influences coming out of modern, the most current science we have, genetics and epigenetics, neuroscience, affective neuroscience, epidemiology, certainly individual psychology and social studies, all point us in the direction that this is a social phenomenon. Now let's talk about the implications of that. That when we recognize that this is socially induced, the perspectives that place us at risk, the values that place us at risk are learned. That's what I mean by social depression, that depression is a learned phenomenon for most people. It's a product of faulty learning, but learning. So the idea then of treating that with a drug totally misses the point that depression is a more social problem rather than a medical problem. Now, what goes on in Iceland, though, doesn't fit with that recent evolution of concept. What is the most common form of treatment in Iceland? Antidepressant medications. And when we look at that question a little bit more openly and honestly now, unless you have been staying current with the literature, you probably wouldn't know that in the last 5 years, the drug companies that manufacture antidepressants have been very badly beaten up because they were caught in lies and deception, hiding the data that showed that the antidepressants don't work as well as they advertise, leading people to believe the drugs are more effective than they really are, leading people to believe the drugs are safer than they really are. And now that they've been caught, there are all kinds of lawsuits that are evolving, and 3 of the major antidepressant manufacturers are quietly getting out of the business. It's been crazy in the United States about all of these issues revolving around drugs. And it really peaked with the cover story on Newsweek magazine, a national magazine, addressing the question of how well do antidepressants don't work. And the cover story read, "The depressing news about antidepressants." If you are not familiar with any of what I'm talking about, I would strongly encourage that you get a hold of this book. There are many books out now about this very issue that I'm talking about. But Irving Kirsch, the author of The Emperor's New Drugs, is one of the most well-known and well-respected researchers in the domain of placebos. And of course, one of the things that we've known for a long time is that depression is highly responsive to placebo-based interventions. We haven't really understood why that's the case, but we're learning more and more about why that's the case, and part of what we're coming to realize through this research is how much depression is a product of perspective. How much depression is a product of perspective. Well, the placebo effects have interested me in particular. So much of the work that I have done has also revolved around the phenomenon of hypnosis and the ability to get people focused, build a frame of mind, introduce ideas to them that change their physiology in measurable ways. The reason that I'm here in Reykjavik right now is I'm doing 12 days of training with a very sophisticated group of clinicians who are learning how to use hypnosis in psychotherapy and behavioral medicine. But part of what they're learning, one of the topics we address is pain. And what a curious thing to be able to say to somebody, sit back, close your eyes, focus, introduce a bunch of ideas that allow this person to literally go into an operating room and have their body cut open with no chemical anesthesia, just the hypnosis. Fascinating. How does that happen? What does it say about the strength and quality of focus and how we can use it in new ways? So this power that people have that they don't realize they have is mobilized in a variety of ways. Hypnosis is one of those ways. Placebos are another way of mobilizing that unconscious kind of process. But even for the people who are big fans of medication, this is the last slide I'm going to show you about drugs. But even if you like the idea of antidepressants, you would still have to appreciate they're limited. When I wrote the section on medications for Encyclopedia Britannica, I pointed out there are some advantages. Antidepressants, when they work, which is in not quite 50% of cases, will help with what are called vegetative symptoms, physical symptoms, energy level, appetite, sex drive, fatigue levels, that sort of thing. But what the medications won't do, because they can't, is teach coping skills, help people be more realistic in the way that they look at things, help people develop better relationship skills, better quality of information processing, better problem solving, better decision making, how to build a network with other people when we know how important those attachments are, how to overcome your history of adversity, how to build a realistic and motivating future. Drugs can't do these things. So the purpose in me talking about this tonight is let's start to shift the momentum back. Let's stop looking for biological miracles. I say this, and let's see if time proves it to be true. But I will go on record saying there will never be a drug that cures depression any more than there will be a drug that cures poverty or child abuse. It's the wrong lens for the problem. You can't solve a social problem medically. And what we're striving to do is help people acquire the skills. Now we can start to get more specific about that. Well, this is kind of the current state of things. The World Health Organization monitors health conditions around the world, recently declared depression the fourth most significant cause of suffering and disability, and predicted that by the year 2020 it would rise to be the second. This is what I meant when I said at the beginning, depression is increasing in every age group. So when we look at the social side of the equation, it's easy to appreciate what happens in relationships. We are wired to be social. Our brains are wired to be social. One of the first things a newborn learns is biological pattern recognition of how to recognize faces. Why would evolution require us to have facial recognition be one of the first things, if not the first thing we learn? It's a curious thing. Social from the very, very beginning. Well, on a more practical level, look at how often other people are the source of our problems. The rejections that we face, the losses, the betrayals, the humiliations, the abuses, all the things that can go wrong when relationships are dysfunctional or when relationships aren't working very well. And obviously these are all social phenomena. One of the things that I find really compelling is at the turn of this century, psychology was challenged in a new way, the field of psychology. The then president of the American Psychological Association is a very famous psychologist named Martin Seligman, who spearheaded a movement that has come to be called the positive psychology movement. That instead of focusing on what's wrong with people, how can we focus on what's right with people? And Seligman and one of his colleagues, Chris Peterson, pointed out quite articulately, we have this big, thick manual that lists all of the emotional disorders. Why don't we have an equally thick manual that lists all of human strengths and virtues? So they went about compiling one. And they did it on a cross-national basis, 34 different cultures represented, to look at what represents the best of human experience. And interestingly, when you look at the list of human strengths and virtues, it includes things like honesty, compassion, generosity, self-sacrifice. Isn't it interesting that when we look at what the best things are that people can do, that they happen in the context of human relationships? That the best strengths we have come out, potentially, in the way that we deal with other people, the best or the worst. How often I'm dealing with, and other clinicians are dealing with, people's pain over misperceptions about relationships, seeing rejection when there wasn't any, feeling excluded when you really weren't excluded. The kinds of misinterpretations of other people's feelings and reactions, and not really understanding other people very well at all. Well, part of that is because our mood serves as a social filter. And by that I mean what mood you're in influences the quality of your judgment. When you're in a great mood, you think your child is wonderfully energetic. When you're in a bad mood, you think Ritalin. When you're in a good mood, you think your partner's sarcasm is funny. When you're in a bad mood, you think it's mean. When you're in a good mood, he's thrifty. When you're in a bad mood, he's cheap. Even something like humor is mood dependent. You know that. When you're in a good mood, things are funny. When you're in a great mood, things are really funny. When you're in a fantastic mood, earwax is funny. But when you're in a bad mood, not so much. Humor is one of the first casualties of depression. So the fact that we make these judgments filtered through our mood state obviously has consequences then for where this relationship is going to go. But this is one of the things that's come out of the positive psychology research, regardless of culture. The people who are in positive relationships, including with themselves, do much, much better in terms of mood and health. Here is a study that was published literally 3 weeks ago. This is how current it is. What does this study show? Universities, UC Berkeley and University of San Francisco, analyzed data on almost 17,000 people, looking at all causes mortality over time. Isn't it interesting that social isolation predicted mortality for both men and women equal almost to, and the social isolation matched almost smoking as a risk factor in terms of health and mortality. We need people. We need to be in relationships with people. And the idea now is, how do we do that skillfully? Because that's exactly what depressed people don't do. They damage their relationships, they pull away, they get so wrapped up in themselves that they kind of forget what it means to be part of a system. Well, these skills that I keep talking about are critically important ones. So when we look at the social profiles of depressed people, tending to have fewer social skills, harder time starting conversations, a harder time keeping conversations going, a harder time knowing what to disclose. People find it stressful to have an interaction. Fewer close relationships. That's interesting. For one very simple reason. It is the people in your life that you can open up to and share perspective with that have the ability to correct you when you're wrong. That when you say, here's how I see it, you hope someone else is going to say to you, nah, I don't think you're right about that. I think there's another way of looking at that. Less elaborate social networks, less rewarding relationships, fewer social contacts. That's interesting. There's a newspaper, for those of you that have traveled in the United States and stayed at a hotel, you probably saw the newspaper USA Today. It's a kind of a summary paper. It's not an in-depth newspaper. But they have a regular feature called Snapshots, where they take surveys of Americans to find out how they feel about or how they're acting in different ways. In 1990, they asked Americans the question, how often do you see other people socially? How often do you go out for a beer or a cup of coffee or something? In 1990, the average respondent said that they saw people socially 6 times a month. They repeated the survey 10 years later in 2000. In 2000, people said that they saw other people socially on average 1.5 times a month. 2010, the most recent survey, less than 0.8 times per month on average. People getting more caught up in their own lives, less time available to other people. That fewer social contacts is little by little how people get more isolated. And the problem with isolation, put it plainly, is when you're by yourself, you're stuck with what's in your head. And what happens if what's in your head is wrong, or it's depressing, and you don't have the opportunity to expose it to somebody else and get it corrected, or likewise, get it affirmed. Depressed people get less social support. If you break your leg, people will bring you pizza and beer. You get depressed, people don't want to be around you. How many of you like being around depressed people? Depression drives people away. It doesn't bring them closer. It makes people angry. People might be supportive the first time you go through a depression. They might even be supportive the second time. By the third time, they throw their hands up and they don't want to deal with it anymore. It has a very negative impact on relationships. As I've already alluded to, more marital problems, more family arguments, more pessimism about the future of the relationship. So the quality of your relationships, as I'm pointing out, is clearly a significant predictor of your depression. Why it's so important that people get social skills training. And especially, obviously, I'm talking about younger kids. To be able to go into the schools, if you have young kids at home, this is the time for them to start to really develop the social skills. Now put it in context. I'm mostly talking tonight about adults who are depressed. What you may not know is depression doesn't typically exist by itself. Most of the people who suffer depression also have another coexisting disorder. This depression is, in clinical terms, a highly comorbid phenomenon. It has coexisting disorders, the most common of which is an anxiety disorder. Now, it's only in the last few years where we have longitudinal or long-term studies to look at the onset, the question, when people are depressed and anxious, did those just come together at the same time? And as it turns out, the answer is no. Anxiety typically precedes depression by, on average, about 7 to 8 years. Now think about the implications of that. Here's this 8-year-old child who is already showing social anxiety. This child is at an elevated risk for becoming a comorbidly depressed adult. And you can see the split in parents. They bring the child in, hopefully. And the mother says, I'm really worried about my son. And the father says, he's okay. He'll find himself. He's young. He'll be all right. Now that's a curious question. You see this child who's anxious, who's at risk for becoming eventually a depressed adult. What should you do? Should we give this kid some treatment? Should we step back and not pay attention to it and just hope that he outgrows it? I can only say if it was my kid, I'd want this kid to get treatment at the earliest possible moment. Learning how to master your anxiety is one of the best prevention tools for eventually becoming depressed, being able to prevent that as best as possible. So we have preventive opportunities. We can do more to screen anxious children. We can do more to screen women who are at risk for postnatal depression or postpartum depression. We can do more to build the social skills and problem-solving skills into the schools and start training kids early on. For me, this is the most gratifying part of my life. When I started studying depression, I was hoping to make a contribution to the world of treatment. But the more that we've learned about the patterns of depression, the very kinds of things I'm talking about tonight, about problem-solving skills, coping skills, relational skills, and so forth, the more that we've learned that when we teach people these skills, it not only has treatment value, it also has prevention value. So we've actually been going into the schools to do what I'm talking about. Teaching kids who are 8 years old, 9 years old, 10 years old, the kinds of problem-solving skills and social skills, and then tracking them for years. And it's remarkable that 5 years later, 7 years later, these kids who learned some of the most basic skills have less than half the rate of drug abuse, less than half the rate of alcoholism, less than half the rate of teenage pregnancy. When you're 13 and you have a baby, your life will never be normal. To be able to prevent that, and to me that is what's so encouraging about all of this, that at this point it's fair to say we have learned so much about what it takes to help people if people would just go for the help. And that's part of why I do this, to want to give a public lecture or to go on TV or to go do interviews, is people won't seek it out themselves, but if you put it right in front of them, they'll go for help. Most of them. So it's really a valuable thing to make it available to people, and that's really why I'm here. Well, let's get specific then about when I talk about social skills, what am I really talking about? Just a quick run through here. So these are 2 books that I wrote for the general public. Most of the books I've written are for the professionals. But this has been part of the challenge for me. How can I take this great body of information and turn it into something that's good for self-help? So the first one, the mistake that people make is they think that other people are just like them. Other people are not like you. They don't care about what you care about. They do care about things you don't care about. You can't use yourself as the reference point. This happens to be one of the most common relationship issues. Here's how I feel, so you should feel the same way. You don't feel the same way, I can't be in a relationship with you. It's just not an effective way of doing things. Learning to assess other people realistically. How often it's the case that people walk in, sit down, and tell me how deeply disappointed they are in this person. They wanted things from this person that this person isn't going to give them. They want this person to be faithful. This person isn't faithful. This person is a sexual opportunist. They want this person to be honest. This person can't be honest. They tell you what's convenient, not what's true. They want this person to be able to make a commitment. This person can't make a commitment beyond themselves. They're committed to their own well-being. So when you go out with somebody, how do you assess them? How do you determine who this person is and what they're capable of in order to know, can this person do the things I need them to do? And the reason that is particularly important is when we look at what single factor most predicts satisfaction in a relationship, the answer is how well this person lives up to the things that you want them to do. It's about how well this person matches your expectations. But of course, the key question is what happens if your expectations aren't realistic? Here's what it looks like in cartoon form. She says, if you really loved me, you'd win the lottery. She looks pretty unhappy, and she doesn't seem to have a clue that her expectation is entirely unrealistic. I run into versions of this all the time. How much of people's anger and hurt comes from the fact that they have these unrealistic expectations, they don't know they're unrealistic, and then they're hurt that the person doesn't live up to it. One of the critically important things is this message of learning to take action. What happens for people who are prone to depression is they are so quick to give up when they run into just a little bit of difficulty. It's a pattern called low frustration tolerance. And that ability to take action cannot be overstated. The people who do best, the people who do best in life, the people who do best in therapy, the people who recover the best from depression are the people who are active in their own behalf. It's one of the problems with medication. Think about the message, here, take a pill. You don't have to learn anything. You don't have to change anything. You don't have to develop any new skills. You just have to take the pill on time. What kind of a message is that? And in particular, this speaks to what is called a coping style, how you deal with problems when you face them. And so that what we are always trying to teach people is be a better problem solver. Handle things directly. The problem is people prone to depression don't do that. They use typically one of these other two coping styles, avoidance, which is exactly what you would think it is. The person sees the problem right in front of them, so they go somewhere else. That's not how you get problems solved. And the other is ruminative coping, the person thinking and analyzing and thinking and analyzing and thinking and analyzing instead of taking effective action. Now, this is interesting when we look at the breakdowns of people who are more active and what they decide is a reasonable solution. This is not a reasonable solution. That is not one of the 7 habits of highly effective people. You know, alcohol is a bad drug. If you are prone to depression, if you are depressed, but even if you're in between episodes or you're just vulnerable to depression, I can say flatly, alcohol is a bad drug. It aggravates the same neural pathways as depression. It is a depressant. It makes things worse. But it is, by definition, an avoidant coping style. You don't like the way you feel, so you go drink. It makes things worse, not better. And there's lots of evidence that that's true. Just something to think about. So what do I mean by rumination? Constantly focusing on how bad you feel, pondering why you feel so bad, talking to people about how bad you feel, thinking about what happens when 25 years from now you're still feeling bad and as if it's always going to stay the same. What's interesting is that rumination predicts depressive symptoms, higher levels of depression, higher levels of anxiety symptoms. And that's one of the things about the anxiety side of the equation. Why will depressed people drink? Because the alcohol helps them with the anxious side of the equation. Again, one of the best reasons to want to learn hypnosis or self-hypnosis and anything in that genre. Hypnosis, mindfulness, guided imagery, visualization, any of the techniques that teach focusing and relaxing in order to be able to manage anxiety directly instead of taking drugs or eating massive amounts of chocolate. So for many people, of course, it may seem counterintuitive, but what I'm literally saying is there's a danger in thinking too much. There's a danger in thinking too much if all you're doing is spinning around and it's really not going anywhere. Here's what it looks like in cartoon form. She says, I'm a typical Jungian archetype demonstrating a variation of the Apollo-Daphne complex with repressed delusions. He says, I'm just a guy from Omaha. Now, if we look at the question, who is at a higher risk for depression, she is by far. Doesn't she seem so deep? Doesn't he seem so superficial? Her risk factor is way, way higher than his. So it is true. Socrates said the unexamined life isn't worth living. Thank you. It's just a very important part of the overall message, how important it is to take sensible action, timely action in your own behalf. And the problem comes when people don't know what action to take. That's the value of talking to a professional, somebody who can help with that. It's no coincidence that the people who do best are the ones who are in more action-oriented treatments. Sitting around and talking about your feelings is not what I'm talking about. Another skill, learn to lighten up and protect the people that you love. You know, it happens so often that I bring in spouses and I bring in kids. And when I hear children say that here are the mean, nasty things that mom says or dad says, I literally have to turn to the parent and say, I'm sorry you're depressed. I'm genuinely sorry you're depressed. But that doesn't give you the right to say these things. Your depression is going to lift, but your child is going to be hearing the echoes of what you said for years and years. How important it is to protect the people you love from your bad mood or your irritability. Well, clearly I'm making the point of how much depression affects more than the individual sufferer. Spouses are affected, partners are family, and families are affected. Well, there's so much more that I can say about all of this, and I'm going to really bring this to a close now as I look at what the time is. I want to say a couple things about treatment, though. There are 3 primary forms of treatment. Certainly, antidepressant medications, the most common form. Psychotherapy, various forms of talk therapy, and self-help regimens. They're not mutually exclusive. Antidepressants, as I've mentioned, can help with the vegetative symptoms, the physical symptoms, but shouldn't be a sole form of treatment. Interestingly, when we look at the question, what form of treatment has the highest rate of relapse of any form of treatment? Medication alone. Just taking an antidepressant, just prescribing an antidepressant is not doing the patient a favor. Psychotherapy is variable. It's as good as whoever's practicing it. Therapists range quite considerably in their skill level. Some who really know a lot about depression and treat it very well, some who know less. Obviously, the implication is you want to see somebody who really knows what they're doing. And the importance of self-help that I'm literally describing as essential. Well, I'm going to skip through this because that's really all of the things that I've already been saying. Just let me close with some final slides about specific advice, things to do when you're depressed. I made a point of saying that there are many diseases where depression can be a predictable consequence. It's why the first stop should be the physician's office. Getting a thorough physical. Is there anything going on that might account for changes in mood states? Avoid alcohol completely. Yes, you. Strive to learn about your vulnerabilities. Everybody's different. I'm always surprised at how little people understand themselves to know their vulnerabilities. I live in Southern California, where the weather is just a little different than here. And we have a big military population that lives in San Diego. We have a Navy base there, we have a Marine base there. So it's not uncommon that members of the military will sometimes come in for therapy. So a man comes to see me, he's in the Navy, he's in uniform, sits down, says, "I'm so depressed." And I say, "Well, tell me what's going on." He says, "Well, the first thing that you should know about me is I'm a poet. I'm a free spirit. My soul is meant to wander the universe. But on a wave of financial insecurity, I decided it would be great to get a paycheck every 2 weeks, so I joined the Navy." What is a free spirit doing in the Navy? So now he feels like he has lost 3 years of his life, which he has, and he's miserable about it. But this is one of the things I run into all the time. People who put themselves in situations where they just don't belong. This isn't you. It may be how you want to see yourself, but it isn't honestly who you are. You have to know yourself well enough. It's like every New Year's Eve, I get invited to parties and people will say, "Party, 5,000 people getting drunk, running around naked, come on." I don't want to go to a party with 5,000 people getting drunk, running around naked. I want to be with 2 good friends. But I have to know that about myself instead of going to a big party and then all night hating myself for going. Why am I here? Why am I such a wimp? Why didn't I say no? Why didn't I say I was sick? What am I doing here? Why shouldn't I be here? It's people. I should be getting along with people. I don't want to be with people, and all the stuff that absolutely drives you crazy. Part of knowing yourself well enough to say, I can be in this environment, I can't be in that environment. I can be around these kinds of people, I can't be around those kinds of people. I can work for this kind of an organization, I can't work for that kind of an organization. And that's part of the artistry of building your life to be satisfying, is to be in situations that amplify your strengths and help you manage better your vulnerabilities. All the other skills that go with this. I'll mention sleep real quickly. It's one of the things about the modern world and 24 hours a day of internet and texting and everything else. Sleep is getting to be tougher for people. Sleep is the new sex. Everybody wants it and nobody's getting enough. So it's one of those things to pay attention to, sleep, and being able to create better sleep patterns. It makes a big difference, not only in vulnerability to depression, but this is the part we haven't figured out yet. There's a very strong relationship between the quality of your sleep and your vulnerability to relapses. So it's definitely something we want to pay attention to. Other things to do, challenge yourself. Part of what I have suggested to you is the danger is what's in your head. The problem with depressed people is they think things and then they make the mistake of actually believing themselves. It's one of the most important skills you can develop in life is asking yourself the question, how do I know? Regular exercise, having fun. In the same way that a sense of humor is a casualty with depression, so is having fun. You know what it's like. You say to somebody who's depressed, hey, let's go to a movie. No, I'm too depressed. Come on, let's go to a concert. No, I'm too depressed. And then little by little, their world gets smaller and smaller and smaller until the depression suffocates them. And part of what happens with depression is people want things to be so deep. When I'm working with couples where one or both are depressed, it's one of the assignments I give them regularly. I want you to go somewhere for the weekend. You are absolutely forbidden from talking about anything of consequence. The motto this weekend is dare to be superficial. As if superficial is a bad thing. But it's what depressed people do. You say to them, so, how are you liking this weather? And they roll their eyes and they go, so superficial. Superficial is the grease of relationships. To be able to ask people, so how was your weekend? Okay, it's not a deep question, but it connects people. Superficial isn't a judgment. The fact that you're capable of being deep, great, but not everywhere, not all the time. Lighten up. Okay. Get and stay connected to others, learn to relax. Again, the value of techniques like hypnosis, and the importance of being more goal-oriented. A lot of how people learn to trust themselves is when they are able to establish realistic goals, identify the steps, and move through them, come out the other side and say to themselves, I like the way I handled that. That's valuable. And being able to be a good problem solver. Get help when you need it. Here are some tips on that. How do you know when you need professional help? Well, the most extreme, of course, is suicidality. You know, suicide's been called the permanent solution to a temporary problem. None of it's worth dying over. Learn to problem solve a little better than killing yourself. When you're feeling stuck, you're not quite sure what to do, when you don't have people around you to reality test with, before it becomes a crisis, and if you're having to make big decisions and you don't want depression to influence the quality of your decision, it really helps to have somebody else to talk to about it. And certainly, from the socially responsible side of the equation, if you know your depression is hurting other people, the only thing to do with any integrity is get help so you limit how much you hurt the people around you. All of these things lead us to then, if you're going to get help, we want to make sure that this is somebody who's credentialed, who has the appropriate training and background, who's current in their knowledge, someone who's going to push you. You know, again, sitting around talking about your feelings is not what therapy is about. People feeling better, that's easy. People being better, a little bit harder. Someone who will also recognize your effect on others and will talk to other people in your sphere of influence. And obviously someone who's regularly available, who's going to teach you the skills, give you the information. All of this highlights be proactive and do something different. So I'm pleased to have been able to do this. I want to open it up to you now for questions. We'll see how long. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.